This is the dot matrix game. Well, that's what it was called up until it was introduced to us, the public, as the Nintendo Game Boy. And this is a short history.
You can take it to the lake. You can take it on a date.
Actually, by most Nintendo employees, it is referred to as Dame game. Dame in Japanese meaning useless or no good, thinking that the name Game Boy was terrible. The Nintendo Game Boy was first launched in Japan on April 21st, 1989, and in North America on July 31st, 1989. Although the Game Boy wasn't the first handheld gaming device to introduce the interchangeable cartridge. That was the Milton Bradley Microvision in 1979. But it was credited with popularizing it. The Game Boy consisted of 4 buttons, a directional pad, a volume and contrast scroll dial, an external connector port, a headphone jack, and a 2.6-inch LCD screen. And in my opinion, launching the success of disposable battery companies for the amount of batteries you go through for hours of gaming. This thing took 4 batteries. The Game Boy was launched with 2 games, but which games would they choose? Nintendo wanted to have a game featuring Nintendo's mascot, Mario. Gunpei Yokoi and the Nintendo R&D 1 team, the developers of the Game Boy, also developed a game called Super Mario Land. Sorenashi, or Without, Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of the iconic Super Mario Bros., making this installment inconsistent with the Super Mario franchise. But even with that said, it was still a big success, selling 18 million copies worldwide. In North America, the Game Boy was bundled with a Soviet Union developed game called Tetris. Even though Tetris was bundled with the Game Boy, skewing the sales numbers of the game, it was still a massive hit with North Americans and Japanese alike, selling almost 30 million copies worldwide, making it Nintendo's top 10 most popular Game Boy games ever. The Game Boy was considered by critics as inferior compared to its competitors like the Sega Game Gear and Atari's Lynx, due to its poor graphics and its perceived bulkiness. I don't know, I thought the Game Gear was pretty bulky. But still outselling those other consoles rather quickly, selling over 1 million units in the US in just the first few weeks. The Game Boy had a lot of iterations over the years. The Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Light, which was a Japanese exclusive. I'll circle back to that one. The Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, and the Game Boy Advance SP. The Game Boy Light was released in Japan in 1998. This iteration solved the problem that us here in North America suffered with for years. Almost a decade. They backlit the screen, making it possible to play in the dark. We asked for years for this problem to be fixed. And you know what the response was? Hey, we added color. That's what you wanted, right? Well, I mean, yeah, but being able to play on long, dark car rides was a bit more of a priority, to be honest.
Hey, who turned on that light? I can't see!
We wouldn't see a backlit screen here in North America until another 2 iterations after the color, with the Game Boy Advance SP. This was a foldable version of the Game Boy Advance. Nintendo of America described the Game Boy as a continuous process of innovation and was always trying to think up ways of how to make the console smaller. Eventually developing and releasing the Game Boy Advance Micro in 2005. Unfortunately, the console was doomed from the start. Not only was it not backwards compatible like the previous advances due to missing hardware, but it was competing against a newer and better handheld console developed by Nintendo. The Nintendo DS, released just a year prior, and not to mention, the Sony PSP had just been released, and you could watch movies on those things. I'm gonna get back to the video in just a sec, but did anyone else know that the Sega Game Gear had an adapter to watch live television? Like, it's beyond me how Nintendo came out on top on all of this. But anyways, carry on. Nintendo had been doing very well up to this point, and with the release of the DS, it's a wonder why they even released the Micro in the first place. What's weirder still is that just before the release of the Micro, Nintendo dropped the retail price of the DS to just $30 more than the Micro, making it a no-brainer to just go with the DS. The Micro wasn't a bad console. Kinda. The backlit screen was very bright, and the colors had quite the pop, but it was uncomfortable to play for long periods of time. The Game Boy Advance Micro was on the market until 2008, most likely just to clear out stock, making this the end of the Game Boy. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color are number 4, and Game Boy Advance is number 11 of most units sold of any game console. And if you want to know, as it stands from the time of this recording, number 3 is the Nintendo Switch, number 2 is the Nintendo DS, number 1, the Sony PlayStation 2. Growing up in the 90s, alongside the creation and innovation of the Game Boy was awesome. I mean, we got 3 iterations. Could add a 4th, but we also got some crazy accessories. Anyone that had a Game Boy remembers the magnifying screen and the light combo. It kinda helped with playing in the dark, but it wasn't great by any means. There were over 1,000 games to choose from. Some in Japan only, unfortunately. It's funny. While researching for this video, I wanted to see if that was the most games for a Nintendo console, but it was actually only number 4. The Nintendo Switch has over 4,000 mainline titles. And if you want to count all the little games, it's more like 11,400. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong. The Game Boy was synonymous with handheld gaming, so much so that every mother in the 90s referred to any handheld gaming device as a Game Boy. So that being said, why did Nintendo do away with it? It's a bit of a complicated and argumentative answer, really. Its success was slow in the 2000s at first, and Nintendo wanted something new and exciting to bring out. Enter the Nintendo DS. Nintendo has never really been the biggest fan of the Game Boy name. Fun fact, it's thought that the Game Boy name was taken from the Sony Walkman, kind of the same play on words. Being unsure of the success of the Nintendo DS, they didn't want to drag the Game Boy name down, just in case it was a failure. They could fall back on the name if need be. But it turned out the DS was a massive success, and Nintendo wanted to jump on it and fund it as best as possible. In my opinion, it seems like Nintendo self-sabotaged the Game Boy Micro to drive people to the DS so they'd have a viable reason to walk away from the project without public dispute. It's unsure whether Nintendo will ever reissue the Game Boy name, but I would argue with the popularity of nostalgia, I think it'll make a comeback one day. And another little fun fact before I wrap up this video, Nintendo loves to leave little Easter eggs, whether it's in games or devices. And going back to the original name of the Game Boy, if you remember, on the back, the model number is DMG01. DMG meaning dot matrix game. A little fun fact. The Game Boy has always had a special place in my heart. My family traveled a lot, so this was my only source of entertainment. Well guys, I hope you really enjoyed this short history of the Game Boy. I really loved researching for this. There was a lot of things I had no idea about. Feel free to comment down below with any other game console or gaming paraphernalia you'd like me to cover. And until next time, thanks guys.